Christmas has come early this year. I am not only with the infamous Chris Albon, but I convinced Neal Lathia to join us today. I'm wearing my famous Christmas sweater. It might be a little early to do that, but we are in December now. So this is another edition of the MLOps Community Coffee Sessions podcast. Stoked to talk with you both, and I think I want to start it off, Chris, with a question that we sourced from the social networks. And Skylar was asking, how do you find the time to do all of the stuff you do, which is have a family and be present in the family? I imagine that's priority. And then run the Wikipedia team and all of that good ML stuff that goes on there. Write, which I've been finding a lot of value in recently and just love what you are writing. And then on top of that, shit post on Twitter whenever you feel like it. Where do you come up with all this time? Do you sleep?
Yeah, no, I sleep. I think, I'll say this. I think one of the reasons that got me interested to going into data science and then more on the ML space was that it was the same reason I like to go, like I really wanted to get a PhD. It wasn't because the PhD was fun, because it really wasn't fun. It was because there was like infinite stuff to look at. And for whatever reason, my brain is hardwired to like want to do the next thing, right? Like, oh, I can read that, and then that reads to this, and that means to go that, and then and I'm just like constantly grinding. And so to me, it's just because I have some weird fixation of just wanting to do the next thing. I don't have lots of side things. Like I ride my bike, but that's it. I don't paint. I don't have a garden. Like I don't have anything else. And those are like I'm not like you gotta hustle and grind. Like I'm not saying those aren't like great things. Those are awesome things. My brain doesn't work like that. To my detriment, right? Like I think lots of people are like amazing cooks and all that kind of stuff. I want to read the next article. The article makes me think about something, so I write something, or I make a flashcard, or I write some code, and then it leads me to something else, and then all of a sudden it's 2 a.m. and then I get up and wake up and do the whole thing again, and it just means that I probably produce more than I probably should. Like I probably should save all this for some kind of like remove noise out of everyone else's feed, but in fact instead I'm just constantly on all the time.
That's awesome. I'm an avid follower as well. I'm sure the folks in the MLOps community would want to hear about ML at Wikimedia and what's it like. So should we start with the snapshot of your team, what you do, where you fit into the big picture, how you interact with other teams? What would you like to tell us on that front?
Sure. So one of the nice things about the Wikimedia Foundation is that because we are all funded by people like all of you, like literally my salary is because people give $20, $15, $5, $2. Like that is actually how I'm paid. There's no like secret other money source somewhere else. We believe that everything that we do should be accessible to people. And one, I think there would be an interesting conversation about how actually incredibly difficult that is when it comes to like infrastructure. But for us, it means that we are, and this is probably the most amazing thing about going to work at the foundation, we are like a top 5 web property, like a website, group of websites, whatever you want to call it. But we are all open. You can see everything about what we do. You can see every server. You can see all of our analytics. Like when our servers go down, you can look at the analytics that I'm looking at to fix the server. You can see our team's internal chat where we are discussing and debating and crying about the server being down. You can look at our we use Fabricator, which is like an open source version of Jira, but like you can look at our equivalent of Jira tickets while like we are going through the issue of like how to fix the server. And because of all that is open, it means that it's one of the rare cases where it's true. Like I've worked at other places that you just had to be really quiet about it. So like when it comes to the team structure, my team, which is called the Machine Learning team, we are responsible for all the models that are hosted by the Wikimedia Foundation. And so there's one separation to probably make is that the community has been using AI and ML, whatever you want to call it, for much longer than the foundation, probably like twice as long as the foundation. They've been using it for like maybe like 12 years, and we've been using it for like 6 or 7 years or something like that. And we the foundation doesn't control the community, right? Wikipedia is owned by the community. We are sort of like its biggest fans. We're the supporters of it. We're making the servers run and that kind of stuff. But we do host models for ourselves. And my team, which is split between machine learning engineers and SREs, site reliability engineers, we are the ones that are responsible for maintaining every single one of the models that are run by the foundation. I think the next question you're going to ask is like, well, what models does Wikipedia run? Which just seems
exactly
to be,
that. Yep.
Look at this. I could be my own host.
All right, bye.
So the models, we do a bunch of different models at the foundation. We do things that mostly help editors. That's our big task. For example, we predict the quality of any kind of article. The idea is that editors can come in and see articles that we think, based on community trained data, are really high quality. Maybe they're ones that are sort of low. Maybe they're sort of ones in the middle, which means that the community can actually see what it thinks articles would be. We also do things like we predict whether or not every single edit is what we call productive or not, or damaging or not. And so we're actually like taking a look at all the different edits and flagging them for editors that the model thinks, well, this is, like is this spam? Is this like some kind of vandalism? Is this kind of like just, a new editor's attempt to like make a change, but they're not really making it that well. And the idea is to direct editor attention towards those. But not make edits themselves. So we don't change Wikipedia. This is sort of a key point, is that we are not editing Wikipedia. We are actually just informing editors and saying, hey, there's this interesting thing. But the stuff that I'm really interested in is the stuff that we're starting to move into now. So for example, on Arabic Wikipedia and a few other sites, we're demoing this feature which we call Add a Link. In Add a Link, as you can imagine, taking it one step back, as you can imagine, when Wikipedia was started, everyone sort of had a laptop who was editing it, right? So the UI is really sort of assumes that you have a laptop. And now as we go into the era of having Wikipedias in communities that aren't laptop centric, and having people who just, even in places where everyone owns a laptop, they're not actually surfing on their laptop, they're surfing on their phone. How do you make it that people can engage with Wikipedia and edit Wikipedia on the phone? And one of the ideas that came up from the product team was the idea of recommending what we think would be links between articles to new editors. And it does two things. One, it means that new editors can come and sort of see edits that they could make that would probably not be reverted by other staff. Because we're saying like, hey, this is probably like an easy edit to make. And then they look at their phone and it says, we think that this article, this word aluminum links to the article about aluminum. Yes or no, do you agree? And if they click yes, then their account makes that edit. And so they get marked as that edit, and they can discuss that edit with other editors and that kind of stuff. And if they say no, it just goes away. But the other thing is you could do it on your mobile device, which is really the key part, because there's no way the future of Wikipedia is everyone has more laptops around the world, right? The future is clearly that people have mobile devices, and using ML to make it easier for people to get started on Wikipedia using the mobile devices is sort of like a really interesting first step when it comes to, it means you could literally sit at a bus stop and like just sit on your phone and click and click and click, and you're editing Wikipedia, right? In a way that sort of fits with the natural workflow. That's the stuff I'm really interested. There's a lot of things along those lines, but it is about assisting people who are trying to edit Wikipedia to do it in a way that they are the ones who are actually making the edit, but we can suggest things. We can provide them a little bit more context. We can sort of like nudge them in a direction that we think would probably be like the thing that a new editor could do to not have their edit reverted. We could suggest, that kind of thing. But we're at the end of the day, we're not editing Wikipedia because the foundation doesn't own Wikipedia, so we can't we can't edit it.
So you mentioned machine learning engineers and SREs as well. So where does in the spectrum of ML systems, all the way from idea to person on their mobile phone accepting those recommendations, where does your team sit in? Are you also covering the model training lifecycle, or just the inference side? How does it all fit together? You also mentioned product teams as well.
I'm so glad you asked that. That was exactly what I wanted to ask. Thank you for reading my mind right there.
Yeah, so the typical workflow that we are really striving towards is that the product teams, so there's lots of different product teams. One's working on making new editors' lives better, one's working on like new readers and those kind of things. But say someone on one of those product teams has the idea after talking to community members that we should have an add a link model, right? We should just new links to the viewer. They would put together a team that would have like designers and translation folks and community relation folks, and to figure out what feature they wanted to do. And if that involved ML, my team would become involved and the researchers would become involved. So we have a really, really, really strong research team at the foundation. And oftentimes they are used for the most difficult questions. So my team's more engineering focused. So we have and do train models all the time. But like the really, really gnarly tasks, right? The ones of like, hey, can we extract knowledge out of all the text from every single article? Like, who knows if that's possible? Let's try it, because it'd be really interesting if that was possible. Those tend to go to the research team. But we are always there as sort of the partner with the research team. Like that's the model we're really pushing towards, is that when a researcher is working on something, how it's done traditionally at the foundation has been that the researcher would like spend months figuring out how a model, and the end point of that would be like a Jupyter notebook. And then they've like handed it off to the engineers who have to like figure out where on our infrastructure to deploy this thing. Where we're moving, and this is like the big change that we're trying to make, is that because my team's more new, it's sort of 2 years old, we're moving to the part where my team would be involved right at the start. And my goal, and my stated goal for my team, and my stated goal for like all the people that we work with, is like the first second that you have a model, whether the model literally is just a baseline that returns true, I want to deploy it to production. Like I want to deploy it to production right away, because I want to make sure that we know it's in production. I know to make sure that it works. I don't want the handoff between my team or the researchers in my team to be a big deal. I want it to be like, actually, we've done this thing. We've actually deployed it 70 times before the actual handoff between the research team and my team. And the other benefit is that, I am a big fan. I'm a big fan. I know Agile has like a lot of stuff. I'm a big fan of the core idea of Agile, which is like make a workflow all the way through, right? If you're making, like this is the basic concept of an MVP. If you have a food delivery startup, don't sign up 12,000 drivers and then build your infrastructure and then sign up the restaurants. Sign up one restaurant, you be the driver, and have a bad website, and just like have that full workflow of someone ordering something, and then you can add more drivers, and then you can add more features. And for us, it's the idea with like new products and services. So what we want to do is make it that even with the worst possible model, the first attempt to model, we have that whole work through that's deployed to our system. It's live. It goes to the public API endpoint. We have some documentation on it, and then we can add more documentation. We can make the model better. We can, make it scale more. We can make it run faster, which is obviously a huge issue. But we can do that with that model, like baseline, it works. It's live. Let's try to improve it, as opposed to here's a Jupyter notebook. I have not consulted you on anything to do with that Jupyter notebook. Let's try to make it run live, which is always like a very, very, it's a difficult task, right? It's just a gnarly task. It involves like because then you have to go back to the researcher and you're like, well, could you use this library instead of this one? Because we support that. It's just like, it's a difficult handoff. And so that change is really like that end goal that we want to go through. Right now, we're sort of working on the backlog of models that have been like put up in the various places in the foundation and actually moving them to our infrastructure. But to me, that Agile workflow is the most important, probably, change in how we work with other teams, which I think is super important.
Yeah, this was a bit of a selfish question on my part, I guess, because my team's currently going through a different transformation whereby now, instead of, we send people out into other teams, right? So if there's a product team that wants to ship ML, we put an ML person into that team. And so it's sort of at this intersection of workflow and technology, ensuring that like the way you ship ML across the org is uniform, and then people and skills and problem sets and stuff like that. So it was super interesting to hear. maybe I was going to head into the technology landscape next, but Demetrios, I think you had a question coming up.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about, because I've heard a few different guests talk about this transition where they're really trying to make sure that the development of models is done in a very holistic way, as opposed to these parts that try and get pieced together and Frankenstein together. And one thing that I like asking guests is, how do you make sure that you can create a process that is repeatable in that? And when you have the different engineers who have the know-how, how do you get that on paper some way, or make it so that it's not only that one engineer who knows how to do that, and it's the team or the company that can do that?
Yeah, that is actually one of the hardest parts, because I suspect Neal's case, and frankly my case too, like the downside is what people have called like the bus factor. Like if your engineer was hit by a bus, turns out they're the only person who knows that thing, and so then you have to like decide, hopefully they're not hit by a bus, hopefully they like had a kid and now they're doing it, but like it's called the bus factor. And so what do you do in that scenario? It is a problem that is, because the easiest way to solve that problem would be like, well, what I'll do? I'll just have 2 engineers for every single project. But then of course you need twice as much staff members, right? And then when people wonder, why don't you do twice as much work? Because you have twice as much staff instead of you're double teaming everything. The reason that we wanted to do it this way, and the benefit when it comes to like this repeatability, is actually to rigidly enforce it in the infrastructure, because the infrastructure is the thing that doesn't change. So in order to deploy something, you have to go through these steps. There is no skipping steps. There is no sort of like special case around things. And where I think where I might differ with Neal in this structure is that I worry about having staff on other teams that they become sort of like alone, right? And they develop their own habits, and they, you don't have that cross sharing. And I have done that the other way before. I'm not like, this is a better way. I'm saying like, there's these cost and benefits. So like, do I have the person really embedded with that other team, but they are a little bit more alone than like when it comes to some kind of issue? Or do I have a task go to the whole team? But then of course, you run into the opposite problem, that you're like not actually as close as you might want to one of the product teams. I don't have a super great answer to that, right? Because all you're doing is playing off trade-offs. The best thing that I have come up with is having rigidly enforced policies, normally, ideally, enforced via code. So if you want to deploy, you need to pass these tests. Passing these tests requires that you're structuring everything in a certain way. Therefore, you can care less about like the individual nuances of a particular engineer because they are passing those individual tests. There's a lot of nuance in there with that, because, for example, if someone uses a library, that isn't supported by Kubeflow, you can create a custom server to support that individual library. But then, of course, like, that opens a can of worms down the line, because they might do a common library, or they might do like a really weird library, but it still works because you can create a custom service for it, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But then the next person comes along and needs to fix something, and it's like, what is ML, like ML Coolio 234 like app? Like, what is this library? I've never heard of this before. What do I do with that? And it is one of those issues where, like, to me, the best thing you could do is just impose it with code, but that's not a perfect solution. There's literally no perfect solution for this.
Yeah, I think there's an element of team size here, Charlie. How big, more or less, is your team?
We are 6 people.
6 people, yeah. So I definitely echo the sentiment of not wanting to leave people by themselves. And yeah, so I definitely centralized my team when it was small. Now that it's just over 6 is where we're starting to fan out a little bit. I think the best analogy that I've come up with is that if I look at peers in engineering in really large orgs, like you can have engineers in 1,000+ person companies, and they're all shipping code in the same way. and so they can focus on what is the like business logic of their particular team or unit or department or whatever words you're using to describe the org. And in ML, ideally, we should reach a similar state, right? Where like the way you ship ML in the org is the same regardless, or the systems that use feature stores, model registries, and all that jazz. And so that then the ML folks can like come together around the systems, but then also then solve specific problems in their own areas.
I was just going to mention, Chris, I think I have heard of that ML Coolio framework. It was big in the 90s.
I was trying to think of a
Runs
word
on Spark.
what kind of framework.
It was popular back in the Gangster's Paradise days. And so anyway, we wanted to jump into the next topic, which it goes around the workflow and hardware. And I know people love to talk about tooling around here. We also really try and shine a light on the fact that MLOps is very much a cultural thing, just as much as a tooling thing. But it's interesting for us, like, what kind of tools are you using at Wikimedia? I imagine you're heavily using open source stuff. What does it look like?
We only use open source.
Only open source.
That is
Is that like a rule from the beginning?
Yeah. So the foundation very rarely uses things that aren't open source. Things do get used. So for example, like your HR software, like there is no open source HR software that you want to use. I mean, maybe there is, but I've never heard about it. So we do use, and because it's a big organization, there are lots of cases of of particular non-open source being used. But for any kind of stuff on the infrastructure, the first and foremost thing is open source. And it's because that the foundation believes that as someone who believes in open knowledge, we should be, spending the money that we get from, from donors to support projects that are open source, they're sort of our partners in this. So when it comes to things on the ML infrastructure, our requirement, and this is a message to all of the vendors who email me every single week, if it is not open source, I will almost certainly not approve the purchase. It has to be open source. Because as a foundation, we are open, and that leads you down to some interesting paths. So, for example, the most popular, GPU that you get, NVIDIA, right? That's really the standard. Their support for open source is significantly worse than AMD. So we focus on AMD GPUs, which adds a interesting can of worms because, for example, the documentation around connecting a GPU to Kubeflow, which is the open source model management library that we're using, is great for NVIDIA. For AMD, there's just a little tab that's other, there's there really isn't a lot there. And so it is a problem that we work to solve, and we give credit to our engineers. Like if an engineer on our team goes and actually submits PRs places and that kind of stuff, we fully support that, and they can use work time to do that because we believe that that's the infrastructure that we use. But we almost exclusively use open source, except for there'll be little things we use Slack for conversations, but our main conversations are actually on IRC because it's open source. We just use Slack for some things that you need to have security around. There's some security stuff and that kind of thing, but whenever possible, open source. And so almost everything's open source.
Are there more criteria used to evaluate open source ML tools? I guess in light of avoiding the ML Coolio framework that's got 0 stars on GitHub and hasn't been committed to since 19.
Someone's going to create it now. There's going to be some new framework. So I, as an architect of systems, really hate the cutting edge stuff, and I say that as someone who uses Kubeflow while it's currently, I think the version we're moving to is 0.7. So we're using the cutting edge stuff, and ideally, and this has been the case for my whole career, I prefer the really, really standard stuff that is easy to maintain. It's really well documented. It's really easy to find a consultant to come in to sort of fix some really gnarly problem that you have that your team struggles to solve. the issue that we had is that when we were looking at the various open source MLOps frameworks, they were all new, right? Because MLOps is relatively new. And so there isn't one that's been around for 10 years. And we can just, like, oh, this is awesome. It's, everyone knows this one. This is the one to use. And here's all the stuff around it. And so we did a big review of the various types and settled on Kubeflow because the foundation is moving more towards Kubernetes. And so we wanted to try to build up that knowledge around it. I'll say that the thing that we have to do with the foundation, because we work on things that, typically we run our whole stack from the bottom. So we don't use AWS, right? Not open source. We actually, have bare metal servers that go into, our racks in the data center. And then we install everything on top of that all the way up to how we serve it. And so given that, and given the fact that we use a lot of open source software, we tend to like staff to stay around for a long time. That is a big goal of the foundation, is that people stay around for a while, because, there's a lot of esoteric parts to having our own stack, right? There's a lot of things that are sort of unique to the foundation because of the way the foundation does stuff, and because we're like, everyone uses this closed source tool to do that, and we're like, no, we use this totally different open source tool. And and it even goes to our open source nature. So we don't use GitHub. We use Garrett, because Garrett is open source. Garrett is a less well-known code repository. And now we're actually doing this big migration to self-hosted GitLab. Why? Because it's open source, right? And so like that, it is a fundamental feature of the foundation, but it means that you need staff who they just learn everything about the infrastructure. They know all that nuances around it, and they stay around for a long time, which is sort of like the goal. And you see staff at the foundation tend to stay, like I am almost 2 years in, and I'm like a youngin. I'm like a Padawan compared to like a lot of the staff who have been around for like 7 years, 8 years, and that kind of stuff. And that part of it is really, really unique to the foundation. And I think, because when you I think the thing that people don't realize about it is that Wikipedia is a really, really big website. It scales lots, et cetera, et cetera. But when you actually cut it down to like how many people are in charge of like some specific thing, there's, like the tech department we have is 150 people, and we're in charge of the whole infrastructure. So then when you cut it down and you sort of like remove, like you slice it and dice it, it's actually like 4 or 5 people are in charge of this critical thing, and they're the only people in the world who know it, and they've been doing it for 8 years. And so like you really hope they stay for longer, because they're the ones who know all the nitty-gritty details, and a lot of the community members, and a lot of the issues that have come up to the past. And so for us, like the good part about the open source is that, we are not beholden to any kind of corporate infrastructure. And I'm not like, this isn't some like deep political take. This is the idea that like, if we wanted to, we could just move all of Wikipedia over to a different set of servers in a different country, in order to protect it from anything. That is the independence that you gain from being able to set your stack up from scratch. The downside is that you need to have staff who really understands a unique infrastructure that is not something that is sort of plug and play AWS from one thing to another. And I don't mock that, because I love AWS when it comes to building stuff, because it is so quickly to, you run a food delivery startup and then you move companies to a healthcare startup, and then it's like, oh, no, it's still AWS. I'm just, different applications are running on it. Where Wikipedia is a totally different infrastructure, where I think on my first day, someone from the data center team was like, oh, like, what do you want us to do with this memory? And I was like, what memory? And he's like, oh, the sticks of RAM. Like, do you want me to install them? Because I'm at the data center. And I was like, what sticks of RAM? Like, why is there sticks of RAM? And it was the moment that I realized that everything at the foundation is actually self-hosted. and so literally there are foundation employees in the data center plugging in sticks of RAM.
Nice. Well, are there any things that you found lacking in the open source tooling for ML that you ended up building yourself? Or are you primarily trying to find the best open source options and then use all those Lego bricks and put them together?
Neal is asking for a friend. Huh? Neal's got his own open source project that he's doing.
We'll talk about that later. In the community Slack, come find me. No, I'm interested for 2 reasons. One, I mean, the people who are listening to this podcast, many of them are building open source tooling. And two, it's just, yes, I honestly believe that a lot of open source tools in and of themselves don't often just fit the bill with a company, right? You have a slightly different requirement. You need stuff to work slightly differently. And so many times I've seen wrappers built over open source tools to like make them fit into a company's requirements. So yeah, if you wanted to put out your wish list of open source tools or talk about stuff that you've ended up rolling with your own, what would it be?
Yeah, I think for us, I would love more open source, like the equivalent of say CUDA for open source. Like I know there are some takes on it, but like my dream would be some really established alternative to having to use CUDA, because NVIDIA is the main game in town when it comes to GPUs. And as someone who has to literally purchase, right, I'm using my own infrastructure, I purchase GPUs. In fact, I tried to purchase a GPU. I even got a photo from the data center person trying to fit it into the server, and it didn't fit. So they took like a photo from the data center of like the GPU not fitting into the slot. And so and because of like there's all these people buying GPUs, there's not a lot of GPUs around. They have to fit into a specific frame of the, of our chassis in the data center, that I would love to use NVIDIA GPUs, because they are, the main game in town. There's lots of them. They're really powerful. They're really well known how things work. They're the default when people are writing documentation for stuff. And as I talked before, like I don't want to go too far into unknown territory, right? I want to stay where there's lots of documentation, there's lots of people to ask questions and that kind of stuff, because we're a really small team. But when it comes to having to use open source, when it comes to GPUs, we have to stay within the realm of open source because of our philosophy, and therefore we have to use NVIDIA, which is a totally reasonable system. It's just smaller. It's just a lot smaller of an ecosystem, and it means that when you run things won't run the way it looks like in, say, a demo or a tutorial or something like that, because of some nuances between the GPUs. And so, I would love some really well. I mean, I know there's attempts to do it out there. I would just love some like super well established one that was like, this is the thing you use. It works perfectly fine every time. And it just, you just substitute CUDA out for it, and then you're good to go. I would love that. I really love that. I don't even know if it's like legally possible, but that would be the thing that I would love.
So everybody out there, take notes. And any of the people that try and hit Chris up on the weekly basis, the vendors, if you got an open source CUDA that will solve those problems, that is what he will be open to hearing, I guess.
Yeah, that's definitely what I'd love to hear.
One thing that I was wondering about is, like, do you all have a separate platform, like a separate data platform for running the analytics workloads as opposed to the machine learning stuff?
Yeah, so the foundation has what we call the analytics VLAN, so the virtual LAN, where the data that the foundation keeps sits, and that is not accessible to the open internet. And the idea is, for security reasons, basically, like you're hard fencing around the thing that you want to keep secure. And one of the interesting things about the infrastructure that we're moving towards and we're building towards, it was to overcome the idea that we needed to train models inside of that analytics network, right? We needed like it says analytics, but really it's just like the data lake. We needed to train models inside of that because they needed to access to all the different features and that kind of stuff. But we needed to serve it outside of it. And so that led to the architecture being like two Kubernetes clusters, one being inside, one being outside, and then a little pass through between, which wouldn't pass data, but would pass models. And that part of it becomes more complicated when you end up having to do stuff like pre-processing. So if, say, you have, you want a cache of pre-processed data. So to give a real example, someone wants the article quality of article 24, right? Whatever. They would give us the article ID 24 in this case. That's not how article IDs work, but you get the idea. then we'd go grab the text from that article, right? And then pre-process it as like sort of a transformer first step and then serve it to the model. Well, if that pre-processing isn't actually the text of the model, but actually some kind of piece of private information that we have on, like inside the analytics VLAN, then the production server needs to connect, go back into the analytics VLAN. How would that work? And then leads to complications and headaches all around. But for us, it is like a fundamental feature of the infrastructure to have that data link part. And I think where we have, I think where we've actually failed in the past that I would really like to improve is that our analytics, and you can see all of our analytics, are really focused on keeping the system up and less focused on like uses. Like so we're moving to it, which I'm really excited about. But right now you can hit our API endpoint without having any login. You literally just hit the REST URL, you get a prediction back. And that's awesome. And it's great, except for the fact that people can then not be rate limited. and then you want to change something or deprecate something, there's no way to actually contact all the people who are using it. You don't see what people are using it for because you could just hit the URL and that's how it works. If you change the URL, well, now the thing breaks. And so I would love more analytics on how different models are being used, who are the people who are using them, because I want to talk to them. I want to say, hey, what's your pain point here? Like what's broken, what's working? And most people don't talk to me when they use it, which is nice, but it's also, I want to know. I want to make your experience better. I want to, we're deprecating one model and moving over to another. I want to tell you that. I don't want to randomly one day the URL breaks for you and you can't get a prediction. I want to tell you that we're deprecating it. And so we have all those analytics that right now it's sort of focused on like keeping the servers up, but like I want to move it to a place where we are actually feeding that back into that analytics data lake, in order for the fact that the analytics team, we're not an analytics team, we only do ML, but there is a full analytics team and a research team and like a global data team that they can actually go and take a look at, like, oh, okay, these people are using this model, they're using it for this way, this community really loves this model, this community has actually never used this model, so we should ask them, do they care, or we should turn it off, like all that kind of stuff. I think we really lack right now, and I would love to do more of that. I would really love to sort of have that interface, because I fundamentally believe that any kind of ML that we put out, even if it's for an internal use case or an external use case, is a product. We are putting out a product that we maintain, that we need to treat as a product. And so there is a user experience that comes attached to that product. And it is hard to iterate quickly on the user experience when you don't get to see what people are using it for. Or you only see when people reach out to you, but only a certain biased subset of people reach out to you. And so you're not seeing that complete picture. And it's just like it's not ideal for that product iteration approach when it comes to ML. That I would just love to have more analytics.
Yeah, I guess you hit on a really interesting question there, which is, in the grand scheme of these systems, where should the data platform end and the ML platform or the inference platform begin, given that they're intrinsically linked in both the models and the data? So do you have any sort of abstractions along those lines, like a feature store type of thing, or batch processes that can pull the data out of the data lake into your inference environment?
Yeah, so one of the things that we are going to tackle over the next year is building out that data storage part of the infrastructure. So, say model registries, say prediction caches, offline and online feature stores, and that kind of part. And this is where we're trying to situate it now, is actually in between my team and the data engineering team, and try to fit where that would go. And it is lucky that half of my team actually came from the data engineering team. And so the SREs on my team are originally from the data engineering team. And so they are really, really close to those folks. They have a very strong, very respectful, like really good relationship with them. And it means that when we start talking about having a shared infrastructure between those two teams, right? You have some things that you want to run on Airflow. We have some things that we want to run on Airflow. Let's set up some servers and that. It's that that's a nice place to put, because I'm sure you've run into this case of well, we're supposed to train models and put it into production, which is great. But then there's a lot of data that's required by the model and produced by the model, right? Like a bunch of predictions, say pre-processed data. Maybe I pre-process all of Wikipedia and store it in a database. So when I want that, like if a prediction requires some pre-processed data, it's already pre-processed for me. Then it becomes like, oh, now it's a data infrastructure issue. And then like, do I need more data like engineers? Like, how do you do that? And so we're trying to put it in between the two teams as sort of like a form of shared infrastructure. But that is possible because we have folks on our team who came from the data engineering team, and there's a strong understanding between shared love between those two teams. But I think that would be much less possible if, say, that we were really far away from the data engineering team, and we're, and I think if we were sort of having the strong expectation of like, well, you're not an engineering team, you're a data science team, and therefore you shouldn't think so much about engineering. And it's like, no, this is all engineering, right? At a certain scale, this is all a big engineering problem because, and this is probably the world's least exciting trope, but like the model itself is like one, is like one teeny part of actually a big infrastructure around like saving versions of the model. If you're retraining every night, the training data, the test data, the evaluation data, how do you put that online? We try to make that stuff public. So how do you make that stuff public? What about prediction caches? How do you make it how do you spin up the thing from scratch, right? So what are your sort of like Helm charts that you're using to deploy that thing, on whatever server? How do you have the staging server, the development server, right? Like suddenly like very quickly becomes like, oh, this is an engineering problem. This is not a feature engineering problem. This is actually a relatively new, it's old because it's engineering, but it's new because it's like a new engineering structure.
Yeah, you touched on a bunch of points there in terms of getting models into production. I'm curious about the experimentation aspect of it. Are you running like shadow deployments and A/B tests as well? And is that another component of your infrastructure? If so, or how do you shape those up in your team?
Yeah, that was actually one of the main reasons that we decided to go for Kubeflow, because it has those out of the box, which our current setup, like the setup that we're sort of moving away from, doesn't have that. And it is actually, I'm a big believer in the idea of like there are no hard problems, there are only like slow iterations, right? Like anything you do all the time, you'll be really good at. And not having the ability to sort of A/B test stuff means it's slow, because you try to test something, like with 2 users over a week, and then you see how it goes, and then you kind of put it into production and see how it goes, but then you have to like wait for a week to sort of get some results, instead of just like constantly testing stuff all the time, even shadow model testing stuff. So like you don't even need to like interrupt, prod. Prod looks exactly the same. You're just sort of getting all this data. But that was a major benefit of adopting a major, the most mature probably MLOps infrastructure as an like open source project of an MLOps infrastructure, was to have all that kind of stuff. Because when we looked at replacing our existing infrastructure 2 years ago, the idea of building all that stuff from scratch was like not a viable option, right? And when you adopt open source projects, you're adopting all these, wonderful people who are contributing to it. And for us, we've had these great moments where I've talked about using Kubeflow, or had some problem with Kubeflow, and I've talked about it on a live stream, or I've talked about it over, like how we discuss things on the team. And Kubeflow contributors have like come out and helped out, like come and say, oh no, I know how this works, this is how to fix it. And that's incredibly valuable to us, because we are a teeny team with very little resources. And so having that ability to do that is huge.
I guess the bit that I struggle with Kubeflow, we talked about GPUs, and it just feels like all of these problems are at such a low level of abstraction compared to what I actually want to be doing, right? Which is training ML models and shipping them. So what are your thoughts on that view? Because there's like this stack of abstraction that I feel in ML, we're still forced to think about bare metal, even if we're using AWS, because, CUDA out of memory. But but yeah, what are your thoughts on that? I feel we're still stuck too far down the abstraction stack overall.
I think we are definitely. I don't know if well, I would say that we are probably too far down the stack, but I think the way it feels like it's going to me as a field is that ML ops as like a type of engineer is becoming more and more of a thing. So a regular engineer, as in like, not a data scientist, not a, AI researcher or something like that, but an engineer who is used to problems of serving ML. So all the issues around that, all the data infrastructure issues around that becomes a really important layer when you try to do something at scale. Because this is probably the same with all of you, but like when I started in ML, which was a long time ago, I would just like train a super cheapo model using whatever R library I was using at the time, and I'd show it on my laptop, and it'd be 40x better than the manual way they were doing it, and I would look like a wizard, right? But of course, the issue with that is that was 10 years ago. Now they've had 10 years of experience with ML. They've had 40,000 models in production over that time. Like they've dropped a bunch of them, but like over time they've deployed 40,000 times. There's big legacy, there's big mess. It's wrapped up in the infrastructure. It's critical to the business. Okay, well, in that case, what do you need to do? And I would love for there to be some open source third party application where I don't need to care about all that kind of stuff. But I suspect the actual way it'll trend out is that there is a group of engineers, probably with the title of like MLE, MLSRE, something along those lines, that knows how to do that stuff, and they are really valuable, and companies hire them. And like there is, like for us, when I joined, it was really, I had like a blank slate to sort of design the team how I wanted. And I looked around the foundation, and it wasn't that there wasn't people who knew how to train ML models. It was that no one knew how to deploy a model. And so it was like, okay, cool. This is a place that I can fit in and actually enable people. The research team is incredible. They're like experts on computer vision and that kind of stuff on the team. And so for us, we do train models, but also the thing that we can do that no one else can do is we can get those models out in production, and we can make them live, and we can make them stable, and we can make them like any other product that you would want to serve.
What's your proudest model?
Oh, my proudest model?
Yeah.
I think
this is the interview question I use. So
yeah.
You're getting it. Yeah.
So this is, I'll say this, like, I think the proudest things that, or the things that like I really appreciate a lot at the foundation, are that we have a lot of models that are trained by the community. And it is such a wonderful approach because we have a lot of models that are like language specific. So it's like French Wikipedia trains what it thinks article quality is. So we train a model and then serve it back to French Wikipedia. And it means that, at least in my head, that the community has a lot of say in how that models work. Any kind of biases that community has, any kind of particularities of what it thinks things are actually served back towards that community. So the community's in charge. And so if they want to update stuff with new training data, that's possible, and that kind of thing. I think that's really nice. I also think that's really difficult to scale. And so some kind of hybrid approach that's like, here's a global model that predicts article quality, but then also here's like some like specific communities have also created a model just for their community is probably the approach. But for us as a community governed, like our board isn't, CEOs. Our board is members of the Wikipedia community. That is how the foundation is governed. And therefore, to have models that are trained by the community was really interesting and fun, and not what I expected as someone coming from sort of the more corporate world at that point, where it was like, oh no, I mean, don't worry about individual communities, like cheap scale, fast, cheap scale, which is definitely a real solution that one should use, because there are lots of problems with the language specific stuff. But it's cool, it's super interesting. It's small scale, which is just nice from a community perspective. They have a say in how it works.
So someone in the community trains a model, and then you put it up for live inference. Did I get that right?
So how we work is that we want communities to be able to govern the models that affect them. And so we actually train a lot of the models that put out in production. But over the years, the community has trained a lot of the models, a lot of the models.
I see.
It is something that we would like to do more. I think one of the biggest issues that we've had is that our original MLOps infrastructure, which is called ORS, which started before MLOps was even a thing, written by a researcher, like sort of before basically solving his own problem of how to manage these models. It is at this point like really difficult for other people to use, because you'd have to, like, if you wanted to train a model that we would put into production using this old infrastructure, you'd actually have to run the whole infrastructure on your laptop. I've discovered it doesn't seem to work on Macs, which is also difficult. I think I had an intern try to do it, and I had a Google Summer of Code fellow try to replicate our models, and it took both of them 2 or 3 weeks to figure out how to do it using that infrastructure. And these aren't complicated models. This is a complicated homegrown infrastructure. And so what I would like actually is I would like to sort of, and this is our goal with the new infrastructure, that the models that we put out, either we train as a team or the researchers train or community members train, they are actually simple and straightforward and put on GitLab, and you can look at them and you can sort of see, oh, this is a scikit-learn model that does this, and people can contribute to it very easily as an open source project. But for us, the main part is not so much that people train models and we put it out there, because as a foundation, we're ethically responsible and sometimes legally responsible for like the models that we host. And for us, it is very important that the community that is impacted by the model has a say in that model, right? And so, for example, if I don't speak Swahili, but if I trained a model for the Swahili Wikipedia community, I would not allow myself to deploy that model without making sure that the community got a chance to see the model, had what we call like a talk period is the thing that we're trying to develop, of like the community can actually go and talk about what, has a say in that model, has a say whether they want it at all, has a say if we turn it off. And I even, I talked at the beginning about the idea of add a link being demoed for Arabic Wikipedia and a few other wikis. But one of the other wikis was actually German Wikipedia, and they asked us to turn it off because of the fact that how they deal with links inside articles is different than Arabic Wikipedia. So on Arabic Wikipedia, it is okay. So if you have an article about, I don't know, cast iron stoves or whatever, cast iron pots, and you say link, you see the word banana in there just randomly. It's like, oh, you can also use it to cook bananas. You link to the word banana. In Arabic Wikipedia, that's okay to do. But on German Wikipedia, the policy is that you only link to articles that if they help explain the original article. So like knowing about bananas probably doesn't help you understand cast iron pots. And so you wouldn't add that link. And so, but that is the community governing the model. They're saying like, hey, your model's actually not doing what we want as a community. Please don't have it. And the other community is like, no, that's actually within line with how we think it should be done, so we could do it. And that part of it is really that critical part. So sure, we train models, the community trains a lot of models and they put them out. But it is that at the end of the day, it has to be the actual community that is affected by the model. It has to be the one. And a lot of what we are working towards is like, what does it actually look like for a community of people, say Swahili Wikipedia, to actually govern a model that is created by someone else? So, someone in Cleveland, Ohio in the US trains a model for Swahili Wikipedia and they want us to host it. Well, how do we make sure that Swahili Wikipedians have said yes to this and they think it's a good idea? And, one of the big things that we are working on is model cards, which comes out like the Mitchell et al. Paper while they were at Google, around the idea that every single model that we host, and we have a proof of concept of this, we haven't deployed this yet, but we have a proof of concept of it. Every single model that we host should have frankly, it's like a media wiki page instead of a Wikipedia page, whatever, like a wiki page that contains all the information that we have about that model. So why it was created, its latest training score, how it does, here's a link to the code, here's a link to the training data, here's how you should use the model, here's how you shouldn't use the model. And that becomes, because every single Wikipedia page has that little talk page, right? Every single page on Wikipedia has a separate page of where people can talk about that. That becomes the point of discussion for those models. That becomes the place for the community to talk about it, have consensus around it, discuss whether they want it, voice their concerns, anything like that. But because we are community driven, it is critical that we don't say, no, we're not going to deploy anything from the community. But then also that one random person can't just make, the like scary example I was using when we've been talking about this is like the Uyghur editor detector, right? Like imagine someone says, oh, I want this thing that I want to apply to like Chinese Wikipedia, and we don't really know what it does. It says, detect article quality or something like that. And so we say, that sounds great. And then we deploy it. And what it really does is sort of detect Uyghur editors, like editors of Uyghur descent and that kind of stuff. Like, we don't, we need to make sure that that doesn't happen. And it is hosted by us. So it is critically important that we make sure that doesn't happen. How would we put those safeguards in place is a non-trivial problem. It's also not a technical problem. It's sort of more of a community problem, which is one where I'm very confident we will solve it, but it is something that we're getting better in place of how we end up doing that.
Probably a deep rabbit hole of where would you even start by defining community. So I won't even ask that as a question.
No, it's a full, it's a big can of worms. How many people is a quorum for a community?
Yeah. And one thing that I was going to mention there is, it's so complicated, not just what you're doing with Wikipedia, and like you said, you're sometimes legally responsible for this, but then there are all of the different models that get trained on this open data set, right? And so how do you look at these large language models that are coming out of what you have open sourced, and how do you think about those things?
Yeah, those are really interesting, and it is one of the, I feel the unique things about working at the foundation, at least unique for me, is that because we put out so much content, right, in the form of Wikipedia, and because that content is used to train a lot of things, that there is literally so much research goes on that around ML and Wikipedia that I cannot keep track of all of it. And whenever I propose something, I'm like, oh, it'd be interesting to extract knowledge from individual articles. There's an article that did it, 2 years ago, someone did it. And, for us, we maintain that we don't control the content of Wikipedia, right? It's not our content. We are the people who support it and host it and make it possible for people to contribute. But it is the community, and it's the community's license, right? Is that matters. It's not our license. And so when it comes to how people use it, it is important that we allow people to use it in whatever way is governed by the license, right? If you want to use it for some commercial purposes and that's allowed in the license, go ahead, right? If you want to do all that but not credit Wikipedia for it, well, that's actually not okay with the license of certain Wikipedias. Therefore, you shouldn't be able to do that. But it is that freedom to not have to not dictate how people can use it, which I think has made Wikipedia what it is, because it's been used in so many places. There are research that gets done sometimes around large language models, around translation and stuff like that I am really interested in, particularly around, say you have a translation model or some kind of knowledge extraction model, and you could suggest that to an editor. So imagine someone is imagine a world where you can extract all the facts from English Wikipedia, which is the largest Wikipedia, and you could actually give those to, say, Swahili Wikipedia as a list of facts. So they don't need to do all the research around it. But what they need to do is write that article, right? So you say here's someone on English Wikipedia spent 200 hours with this 40 citation article about something, basketball, and someone on Swahili Wikipedia could say, okay, cool, that I can actually use that work, that research, that time to write an article in my local context, in the way that my community wants, in the way that my community really feels is necessary. But I can do that using those abstract facts, because in fact, who won who won a particular championship in a particular year is a fact that isn't changing, and therefore you can extract it. That stuff is super interesting. There is a real challenge of translating research into a production system. That is what I've learned from this task, is that it is every single time you dig deep into a lot of these articles, not all of them, but a lot of them, how they are doing it is to accomplish the research task, which is obviously that's what they should be doing. It's a piece of research. But if you wanted to do it in a way that would be governed by engineering, right? You would have a really good uptime. It's really it's efficient. It can run a lot, all that kind of stuff. It oftentimes is an incredibly difficult hurdle to solve, and it is one of the reasons why I think people end up going to like third-party applications for like Google Translate or something like that, because as an engineer, the problem's solved if you put down your credit card, as opposed to, oh, well, we're gonna, figure out this crafty language translation model, say. But I would like to do more of it. I think if I was really gonna adapt some of the things that were coming out from the research community in a way to put it in production, I would need a larger team. But I still say that moving to this new infrastructure and making it easier for people to work with us, right? So like I talked about that old infrastructure where everything's sort of done in a way that's very difficult for people to work on it. Instead of on Garrett, right, put everything on GitLab where people are sort of familiar. It looks exactly like GitHub. It's just like a different URL. Having that code, it's not abstracted away 40 times. You can actually see, model train dot this or whatever. You can actually see the thing. You can see it scikit-learn. Therefore, people can contribute just as they would contribute to any other open source project. The open source project is just the models that we host. That is the vision that I want to get to. That is not the current state of things, but it is critical and it's important, because one of the things that you learn very quickly at the foundation is that, now I'm just going off on a total side tangent, but whatever, is that like open source is not accessible, and what you really care about is accessible. You can put out every piece of code, you can put out every version of every data set, you can put out every single note from every single meeting from every single team at the foundation, and to people on the outside, it's all noise and no single signal, and they don't know what to do. Like, where do I actually plug in? Where do I figure out how this works? And instead, what you want to go for is accessible through open source. Open source is a means to create accessibility. And where we are now with the models is that things are open source, but because they're very difficult to replicate, they are not accessible. And that's where we're trying to push towards, making it so it is accessible, where someone, say an undergraduate student could be like, hey, I do want to contribute to this model. Or someone finds something that's wrong with the model, like, oh, this, Vietnamese article quality model is really slow. And I can go to the community and say, hey, what a great task for someone to take on. And someone could load it onto their computer really quick and just start figuring a way out. Like, how do we make this? How do we make this faster? How do we do that? And increase the number of open source contributions to machine learning at the Wikimedia Foundation by making it actually accessible, rather than like strictly over like open source, which I think is not really the open source is like a means to the accessibility end, not an end to itself.
Yeah, it's a beautiful vision. The making the accessibility and just giving more people more at-bats is such a great way of doing it, because the rising tide is going to lift all boats, right? I want to point out that I really appreciate that you're doing this model cards. That is so cool. I love that. And I mean, on one side, it's like, yeah, you should be, in a way, I feel like you're blazing a new path when it comes to like the ethics around models being out there. And I would hope to see that becomes more standard practice. So I know why Monzo rejects me from Alone, Neal. I hope you're...
Hey, it's because you're not in the UK. You need to be in the UK.
But I really think I appreciate that, and that view is something that we need to talk about. Like, as engineers, we need to talk about that kind of stuff more, and it's awesome to see. Sadly, this has passed like so fast, and we got to wrap it up. It's been awesome though. Chris, Neal, I thank you both for being here. I got to be a little bit of a fly on the wall and just watch and enjoy here. This was a beautiful session. Thank you both.
My annual contribution to Wikimedia is now fully justified. I got my money's worth and more.
Yeah,
that's it.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the I don't actually do the fundraising, but I appreciate all donations.
That's it. Everybody listening,
Everyone
go,
should do it.
yeah, go out there and donate to Wikipedia, and also I remember seeing something come through the community a few weeks back, maybe a month back, that your team was hiring. Are you still, or did you fill that role?
We have one open role for a machine learning engineer. We'll have more in the future, but this is the one we have now.
Depending on how many of you go out and donate, he'll be able to open up.
It is definitely the weird part about the foundation that it is like, if this was a private company, there would be 40,000 employees. And instead, there's 500 people who are maintaining, one of the biggest like infrastructures. I think one of the biggest infrastructures in the world, because of the community that's sort of handling all the content generation is being handled by the community, and we just get to support that.
It's amazing to see. So thank you both, and thanks everybody for listening. If you still are listening and you are on Spotify, give us a follow. If you're on YouTube, give us a like and subscribe, all that fun stuff. I heard on Spotify recently that you can get push notifications when new episodes come out. So depending on how diehard you are about this podcast, you can do that right now. Thanks again, guys, and we'll see y'all later.